Al McFarlane. Welcome to the conversation with Al McFarlane. Today is Thursday, May 11th, 2023. I'm glad to be here and glad to have you along as well. As always, we promise robust conversations. Today will be no exception. I'm pleased to be in conversation with a new friend, a new acquaintance, Dr. Roger Oles, and then later in the program with my colleague, W.D. Foster Graham, and one of my local heroes, author, creative, organizer, politician, De'Vonna Bentley-Pittman. We'll talk about her work as an author and their work together in books. Before we begin, I want to, as always, invite you to support this work, to join us in the conversation. You can do it a couple of ways. One is just showing up as you have today. If you're watching on any of the platforms, we're streaming live on Twitter, on LinkedIn, on 3 Facebook platforms, one for Al McFarlane, one for Insight News, and one for Black Press USA, the NNPA. We're also streaming on the Black Press USA YouTube channel, as well as the Insight News YouTube channel. What I want you to do, what I'm asking you to do, is to go over to the Insight News YouTube channel and subscribe. We want to build our audience, our base, our network, and that is a goal. A short-term goal is to get to 1,000 subscribers. Obviously, the agenda is to develop the numbers to monetize this engagement, to add value, bring value, reflect value, and to do this engagement on a business-like basis as well. So take a minute, go over to YouTube, Insight News MN, and click on subscribe. It costs you nothing, but it keeps you in the loop, keeps you informed, and keeps you in partnership with me and my colleagues and friends. I call these colleagues and friends companions, and we'll talk about why in the future. We typically start with some hot topics, but today I want to go straight into my conversation with Dr. Roger Oles. Dr. Oles and I are both members of an organization, a platform, a community that's called Narrative. Narrative is the word narrative with a K, narrative.com. Narrative as a, just like knowledge with a K. You don't think about that, but this keeps that fresh in your mind. And Narrative is this phenomenal social platform created by Dr. Karen Hunter, the esteemed journalist and Sirius Radio producer, host, author, written a couple of dozen books, teaching a course in journalism at Hunter College in New York. She, in conjunction with Dr. Greg Carr. Dr. Greg Carr is the leader of the Africana Studies Department at Howard University, also a lawyer, but a generally brilliant human being, and a joy to be around, even on the electronic platform that we share, that they've created, called narrative.com. Well, I've gone into that experience by connecting, or to connect with other people. And one of the things is networking. And in networking, I saw a post by Dr. Roger Oles' suggestion he had about how we teach young people to use some of the old systems of organized resistance and protests to effect our interest and our demands for the future. How do we, in a sense, use asynchronous strategic action to move with intention, to protect our interest, even in the midst of an environment that's controlled by billionaires who have no interest in us, our lives, our culture, except for that they can continue to grow wealth by extracting both resources and human capital. So how do we resist that, play in a game where we use our strategic planning and thinking to move the needle in the direction we want it to go? Dr. Oles, thank you for being here. Good afternoon, and welcome to the conversation with Al McFarlane.
Good afternoon, Brother Al. Glad to see you again.
Well, likewise. I read your piece and said, this is great. I called you and said, would you allow me to publish this essay in Insight News? You agreed, and here it is. We've got it coming up in the cover issue of next Monday's Insight News. I'm going to show people the cover and say a word or two about it, but I want to really interview you about what this article says without reading it, but talk us through the scenario you created, sort of a fictional teaching tool. Let's pull the cover up first of all. And we went to Insight's artist, illustrator, Donald Walker, and said, Donald, read this article. It's about how we use our historical protest power in a modern context and how we use it given and considering the banking crisis and what banks do and how they work and what motivates them and what moves them. And this article is saying that with intention and with planfulness, we can go and make banking, make the economy move specifically and move public policy to reflect our interest and our will, our goals, our objectives. And so the story is a fictional account of an elder talking to youngsters about how to get involved, how to get the business at hand and make it happen. I think it's a great story. I'm so glad that you allowed us to publish it. And again, it's available. We'll put the link in the chat so that people who are listening can download or capture this issue of Insight News and enjoy the story as well. Dr. O's, let's talk about this story. You turn the page, if you would, Yasmin, to the actual story in the paper. So we changed the headline on the article because one of the things I discovered in the article was your reference to cash rules everything around me. And that was a quote from Wu-Tang Clan. And I said, this is really a choice way to focus on what cash means to us and how we can use that to our advantage. So let me stop there and ask you to talk about what this article is all about and walk us through the article.
Yes, I wrote the short story, mainly because I was having difficulty with my grandchildren, making them relate to things old fuddy-duddies like us are interested in. And I wanted to figure out a way to get them more involved. So I wrote this story that really shows an elder being influenced by what he learned from teenagers. An elder learned that raves, what's a rave? And the teens explained to him that that's an instantaneous party. And he put that information together with the fact that back in the 1870s, when slaves were freed and called freedmen, there was a bank that was open, Freedmen's Bank, so that soldiers and freedmen with income could save their money. As it turned out, that bank had $3 million worth of deposits by former slaves that were interested in saving their money and investing in the future. Unfortunately, later, the bank, about 1873, the bank was authorized to make loans, and they made speculative loans, kind of sounds familiar, and lost all of the money. And to the point where depositors were only paid back roughly 60 cents on the dollar. He put that thought and his grandfather's reluctance in dealing with banks to say, how in the world can a little person affect change in society? And the way that it can be done is to quit putting things into categories. We've got a social issue and we need to deal with it with social protests. And then we've got banks like Silicon Valley Bank that are going under, and that's an economic issue. And we're trained to keep those in separate lanes. But a good strategic purpose would be the character figures out that why, if I live in this society and it's not treating me fairly, and I work every day, why isn't every social issue an economic issue? So that was kind of one of the first things. The first thing was intergenerational sharing and strategizing, which the youth helped him do. And then he turns around and helps them by showing that they, even though they're small, they've got small deposits, that those could be of strategic value also. And so it teaches, the short story in detail teaches a little bit about history, about grandfather's distrust, and the fact that we stay awake because of social issues at night and worry. And we're appealing to people who live in almost a heaven on earth society. So they're absolutely deaf to what we are complaining about. So it's a means, he says, if we take ourselves seriously, and if we deal from a mentality of ants, I use ants in the story. If you attack an ant, the ant doesn't ask, what's the problem? It just realizes it's being invaded and it attacks. And so there's no leader, there's no social format or formation. It's I strike out where I can, where my strength is, and where my opponent's weakness is. And usually it's around our ankles, and we all respect ants, and no one walks through an anthill. And
well, you should. Do you have the story handy? Your article handy anywhere?
I've got it, but it's in the other room.
Okay, don't worry about it. So you should read that, but that's fine. Go ahead, just talk about it. That's fine.
Oh, okay. And the point is that an ant is roughly a millionth, it's 30 millionths of the size of a human, but we all respect an ant because we know what it can do. And when we look at a billionaire, most of us might have $1,000 in the bank. That's 1,000,000 times what a billionaire has 1,000,000 times what we have. So it's a really valid comparison. And so what can we do to make a billionaire respect us? And that would be to look at our deposits. Boycotts are too slow, and you've got to organize. And the system is good at...
Before you talk to tell the story that you opened the article with about a person stepping in and having that aha moment, recognizing the power of this minuscule ant over his or her momentary experience. Tell that story first.
Okay. Well, he says when he's a boy, he jumped on an anthill and he stomped it and rolled in the grass, happy, saying, I'm God, I'm king of the hill. And then just when he was feeling super, the ants attacked. And he said that he never forgot about ants since that time. And then he mentions that your savings in a bank may seem minuscule compared to a billionaire. But if you're carrying a picket sign and you're walking down the street, the billionaire pays no attention. But if you have a picket sign and you're standing in line to withdraw your deposit, then he becomes very worried. Billionaires worry about runs on their bank, because the money really isn't there.
Mm-hmm.
The money is out being used to buy products that are overpriced that we then have to buy, or to pay payroll on someone's business, which is busy trying to make more money off of our minimum wage labor. So the adult in the story says, if you want a billionaire to read your sign and do something about it, get in line and consider a strategy of taking your money out of that bank. And in the story, he puts it in another bank. And so what happens is you got a line, and people come up, reporters come up and say, why are you in line at this bank? My confidence in our economy is gone. Why? I don't have voting rights. So he's saying, what does voting rights have to do? The reporter says, what does voting rights have to do with your confidence in the economy? And he just answers, I need voting rights to restore my confidence in the system. In the meantime, I'm in line to take my money, he doesn't say how much, to take my money out of the system. And then he goes across the street and puts it in a different category of bank. So it teaches there are regional banks and there are national banks. Regional banks usually deal with the injustices that are in your region. National banks then are completely separate. Banks aren't banks. They're two different categories. So the adult in the story takes some of his money out of the regional bank and takes it across the street and puts it in a national bank. And so it has a double whammy. They just see long lines at banks. And really, he's putting the money in the other bank so that he doesn't have to carry a lot of cash around. But as far as the reporter is concerned, boy, there are runs on all banks. And that is something that the banking community and the billionaires who provide cash flow for their businesses pay attention to.
Well, as I read the story, it made me think of what happened recently, particularly in the Silicon Valley Bank. And as I read the backstory on Silicon Valley was that when some of the millionaire tech investors felt that the bank's reserves did not meet, the requirement for liquidity, they both began to withdraw money, but also they went public. And the public posture they took basically forced the government to change its policy to ensure and guarantee the deposits of all of these investors. Now, we know that the FDIC insures any account up to $250,000, right?
Right.
Well, these investors had millions in Silicon Valley Bank. And if Silicon Valley Bank failed, a lot of people would be out of millions each. And to prevent that, they went public. It's kind of in the same strategy that you've written about here, to force the government to change policy, to step out on Monday morning saying, oh, your money is safe. Even if it's more than $250,000, if it's millions, all of your money is safe. So they changed policy by going public. And so you've kind of distilled that to how does that apply to us in our community, and how is this a teaching moment? And I ask the question of you, wouldn't it be cool if we found a way to have a demonstration project where some community, could be Minneapolis or could be, a neighborhood in Chicago or somewhere, but just as a training tool, as a training practice, 30, 40 people as a club, as a community, decide we're going to test this idea, and we're going to all determine that we have X amount, could be $1,000 in this bank, and then we decide that if there's a public policy issue we want to call attention to, we will create signs about that public policy issue that we want changed, and go to the bank with our protest signs and line up outside the bank and one by one go in and withdraw a portion of our deposits, right? And the
Right.
image that you're creating is what you're working with. This is really performative. It's theatrical, but the
Right.
theater of this.
Protest marketing.
There we go. So yeah, go ahead and talk about it. Talk about it some more.
Well, first of all, the federal government has no business taking taxpayer dollars and guaranteeing these businesses that are that have their money in there and would have lost it with Silicon Valley. They are rapidly trying to change that and have a system where it guarantees us poor folks up to $250,000, but it guarantees them up to millions, which would be grossly unfair if they do that. So as they try to figure out a way to do that, we need to make sure that they understand a little history. When the slaves put their money in Freedmen's Bank and it made bad investments and was closed, they weren't made whole, but they were told all the time while they were depositing over the 9 or so years that it was open that the government's behind us. The government wasn't behind them, but the government never came out and said, we're not behind you. And so I think the government's liable for all of those 60,000 depositors back in 1870 to make them whole. And we ought to insist that they do that. But they were promised 6% interest per year and $3 million, 6% over 150 years. That's a lot of money. But basically, if during the George Floyd protests, if someone had said, let's go to the banks with our signs, you would have the George Floyd Act today. And I just want to get that thought out there and get it educated among the youth and amongst adults that you don't need anyone else. You go do it. When you do it, other people will follow. And it doesn't have to be something led or coordinated. It's my money. When I feel that I'm not being treated fair in this society, I move my money. And what does it cost you? We're getting 1% on savings. A couple of years ago, I went in, I said, you're paying me 0.05% on my savings?
It's costing me.
It's a freebie. It's a freebie. They're not paying anything for our money. Let's not make it stable in our banks so that they can use it and rely on it. Let's move it when we're unhappy. So the idea is basically find your strength. The strength of the individual is in his individual cash deposit, and find the weakness. Bankers don't like to see people drawing money out of their banks. And I think that your test case on something that is universally accepted as bad would work very well in just having people say, hey, I'm going to the bank. Why don't you come and join me? To me, it's spontaneous. And if we get used to the fact that I'm unhappy, I'm going to deal with it the way this society understands, and that's economic. And move.
Shout out to our friend, Michelle. She's a regular, Michelle Madison. Thank you, Michelle, for watching the show and telling people to join us. And shout out to Mike V. Mike V posted a couple of notes here online saying that most of the Black tech founders kept their money in Silicon Valley Bank, and so therefore our community, their funds were heavily impacted. He also added that Boston Private Bank and Trust was used in Boston for building low-income housing and development. And again, they were connected to SVB, and they were heavily impacted too. Well, Mike V, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are about this idea of how we organize ourselves, elders and young people together to make a statement, about changing policy, a statement that doesn't require a particular single leader, but knowledge and a willingness for all of us to act both in a way that's principled and intuitive, in a sense mirroring how the colony of ants works together to protect itself, the ants protecting themselves individually, but in doing so, they protect the body, the colony, and they create change. Go ahead, Dr. Roger.
I was just looking at, in your SVB example, government runs to help billionaires.
Mm-hmm.
They crawl to help poor people.
If at all.
If at all.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have to demand respect. Stable deposits, when you're not getting any interest anyway, use it to your own benefit.
I want to take a minute just to ask you to tell your own story. You are a scientist, a chemist, I believe. What's your personal story, Dr. Oles?
I'm an inorganic chemist from the University of Kansas. So I graduated there in the early 70s, mm-hmm. and went to work for DuPont. I knew that I was more interested in marketing than chemistry, but that was the big field. Chemistry was the big field when I was in school. So I started out at DuPont in the laboratory and moved over into marketing, and was responsible in our plastics department for creating new businesses out of materials that we made and didn't know what to do with. All
like
we
what?
knew
For
were
example?
their properties.
For example?
I'm sorry?
But like what? What?
We came up with a product that was a hollow fiber that was hollow, but the thickness of a human hair. And so I would get the information on what its properties were, and then my job was to travel anywhere in the world and figure out who could use it. It was a great job. And I found out that it could separate air into nitrogen and oxygen. And we sold it for hundreds of millions of dollars to a French company.
And what was the practical use of the product? How would somebody know what it is in the marketplace?
If you deal with oxygen compressors, people with trouble breathing, what it does is you pump compressed air in one end of the fiber, and out of the other end comes nitrogen-enriched gas and an oxygen-enriched gas. It actually separated nitrogen atoms from oxygen atoms on a proportional basis. And so it's being used widely in industrial gases. Rather than putting in a liquid nitrogen facility, you just put membranes and pump compressed air into it, and you get your inert gas that way. So it was worth hundreds of millions of dollars.
So having worked there and retired, what takeaways do you have from your career in corporate America in general, DuPont in particular? What knowledge, learning, assessment, and advice do you give young people?
Well, one of the big ones is a caution. Things used to be based in the old days on how much does it cost for me to make it, and I'd get 1/3 for labor, 1/3 for the materials, and 1/3 for profit. Mm-hmm. Now it's called perceived value in use, which is a way of saying, don't sell it for what it costs you, sell it for what the customer thinks it's worth. The Price is Right is a program that pushes this heavily. They have these luxury vacations and they give them away and say they're worth $40,000. That puts in the public image the idea that its value is high when it's not. So perceived value and use came as I realized what I was doing. I was looking, how much can this product make us? And I said, perceived. I said, so it's not the true value, it's perceived value. And I retired early from the company. I said, I am fooling society. And that is part of the greed of our society. It used to be, if you had a good business in DuPont and it made 12% per year, full book kept, it was a good business. Now it's, oh, gee whiz, that's a dog. We want stars. We want something where we can sell it for 1,000 times what it's worth.
Wow.
And those membranes I told you about, they were selling for thousands more than the price of gold on a weight basis. So I actually said, I don't want to be a part of this. And I started doing marketing, helping local communities in my own community.
Okay. And so what kinds of things did you do? And did you organize a company to do that? Or how did you do it?
How did I do
working in community? Yeah.
The first thing I did was I started teaching high school in West Chicago, Roberto Clemente High School, just teaching mathematics. And then I started a business club there, and just to show children what the world really is about, and doing more of it in the clubs and one-on-one, and making sure that they understand that you've got to have you've got to have this math, or you're going to be taken advantage of. And then I started a couple of businesses with friends, or helped other people get their businesses started, and mainly focusing on the marketing point, but also focusing on, you can have a successful business, but if it's a successful business, it takes cash and the cash flow management. People don't want to allocate the basic accounting principles that are needed to make sure that you have the management of your income so that you can grow sustainably. And so just a lot of small projects, helping a dentist friend of mine revamp and broaden, expand his dentistry practice, things like that.
So you and I, as I mentioned when we started, met at in the website, the social media platform called Narrative, Narrative with a K, KNARRATIVE.com. I'm encouraging any viewer or listener, when you get a chance, go over to narrative.com. It's fascinating. It's a fascinating community. And it's a community that, as Dr. Hunter and Dr. Carr describe it, is created to invite all of us to bring our own brick to a community that we build together. That this kind of reminds me of what and how you described the coordination of the ants. You know, it's coordinated and uncoordinated. It's intuitive. And so they act in a way that protects, the colony against the invader or the intruder. And they continue building the colony, which is their calling and their mission. So I envisioned what Nubia and Narrative are as kind of like building a new pyramid, a pyramid in the digital space, just as the pyramids of ancient Egypt and Kemet stand today as markers and as tools that teach and that reflect both uh, acquired knowledge and a record of the process of creating knowledge, and a reflection of the world as it was envisioned, both the physical and seen and the unseen worlds.
Mm-hmm.
What do we do like that in the year 2022, 23, and beyond? How do we build something that we intend to be part of the discussion in the year 3023, and in the year 4023, and in the year 5023? How do we move with intention and with purpose so that the things we say and the things we do right now in this moment are guided by all of history that's poured into the creation of this moment, and recognizing that this moment is the gateway to everything else that will ever happen? It's an awesome responsibility, but that's what sovereignty is. How do we teach ourselves then to be serious about who we are, where we are, and what we are doing, why we are here in this existence, in this plane? What do you think?
Well, before narrative, if you had asked me, is there much written by Black folks? I would have said, yeah, you can probably put it in all the bookshelves in my living room. And now, since narrative and starting to remember and to learn from those who remember, it's astounding. I had no concept of, I was still brainwashed to think that Egypt was, that was the Middle East.
No.
It was Black people.
Yeah.
And that only comes from study and listening to those who do study. And the little study that you do, say it to someone so that they can add to it. So I've been completely enthralled with narrative and its network, because I now realize that everything came from us. And I had never heard of Anti-Diop, but now he's a respected scientist,
Right.
as well as philosopher,
Right.
who proved to Europe that Egypt was Black. And just making sure my grandkids understand that, and making sure that they understand that on every bill it's marked legal tender, which means you can use this to pay any bill. No one can refuse it. Little things that we think are little are very important to the youth of today. And we just have to talk more. We have to come up with stories that relate and make them ask us questions.
Are you aware of the work and the role of Imhotep?
Imhotep? No.
Okay.
No.
And that's another discovery that you'll come across. Just the kind of the father of science, right? The father of science and of modern knowledge, and the world. The Socratic and European and Greek systems all are built on stuff they learned in Egypt, and the prime minister of that development period was Imhotep. So that's something to talk about more as we go. Well, listen, I just want to invite people to join me and Dr. Roger Oles over in Narrative. Check it out. It's worth your time. You'll be excited. Dr. Roger, one thing I'm doing, I'm a multilingual, bilingual, put it that way, for sure, Spanish and English. But I've studied French, I've studied Chinese, and I've done some work in Portuguese, very little, but all of it giving me a sense that I understand the value and the power of language, the power of the word, the power of speech, and what it means and how it differentiates us in the living world. It's a unique gift that human beings have, And my attitude about it is that we should try to teach all of our children to be multilingual
Yes.
with intention, and that we should also be able to own or have a sense of equity in all the idioms that we show up in. So one of the things I've done through narrative is taking the course taught by Dr. Mario Beatty. The course is called Metu Netur. And I had the book Metu Netur here in my library for years. I'd look at it, put it up, look at it, put it up. But Metu Netur, the book, the word Metu Netur means divine speech. So the question is, how do we understand language, words, the power of divinity in our speaking? That's one thing. As a consequence that we've decided to, and I told you this, we're going to print the piece that we have in Insight News in English. We're going to create a special edition of it for what we call Afrodescendientes, or some iteration of that. And that's where we take an article in English, we print it in the same document, it'll be digital, we print it in Spanish, we print it in Portuguese, we print it in French, we print it in Yoruba, and Swahili. So it's a multilingual rendition. And I got that from really associating with narrative, coming across the work of Ikwe Arma, the Ghanaian writer, philosopher, novelist, who in his organization with his friends, they've created a project called Per Ankh, the House of Life. That's what it's called. And they've assembled a publishing company in Ghana or in East Africa, and their company pulls up the work or helps Black or African authors bring their work to life, critique it, and then market it independently and control their own means of production. So we're heading in that direction. Is how do we encourage our people to be together in the digisphere and to recognize each other and recognize that our struggle and our future are one and the same. Listen, thank you for talking with me and for listening to me and for sharing. Hang out with me. I want to bring in two other guests, and I'll have you meet them as well, because I think you'd enjoy what they're doing. It's consistent with what you're doing. We always have on a regular basis our books editor, W.D. Foster Graham. Both bring his work and the works of other authors to this program. And today, Brother W.D. Foster Graham is bringing another good friend, a leader, a wonderful human being and creative person to talk about her work. W.D., let me say hi to you first of all. And it's always good to have you tell people why reading is so important, what it means to us.
Well, when I think about what it was like, say back 2 centuries ago, during that time of slavery, when it was dangerous for a slave to know how to read and write, that always reminds me, never take it for granted, because that knowledge is our power. And by reading, we are exposed to a whole spectrum of experiences and knowledge and learning, as Dr. Olds had just described so eloquently earlier. So I love to read. I love to broaden my scope, and sometimes I just love to sit back and relax and just say, hey, take me away. And especially when it comes to reading the works of other Black authors and poets and playwrights. I love it.
Introduce our friend De'Vonna, bring her into the conversation and the important events coming up.
Okay. Well, as an author and as a columnist, I owe a debt of gratitude to De'Vonna Bentley-Pittman for what she has done on the literary scene. I mean, she is the founder of the Minnesota Black Authors Expo. Now, granted, probably outsiders might think there are no Black authors in Minnesota. She proved that to be wrong. She created the space for Black authors to meet, to share their works, and to market their works. Because if you you can have the greatest thing since sliced bread, but if no one knows about it, hey, what good is that? And that venue has only grown, not only for Black authors in Minnesota, but authors around the country. Also, she will be sharing her romantic thriller, Savannah's Inheritance. I love it because it was set in Minneapolis. And I trust and believe. I have been on her case saying, okay, tell me more. I want to know about this character. And trust and believe, De'Vonna knows how to do a book launch. I can speak from experience. So it's my great pleasure to bring to you De'Vonna Bentley-Pittman.
Hey, Savannah.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me, Al and WD.
Well, thank you for what you do. Thank you for being here. I also described you as a politician and leader in community. Talk about, let's give people the De'Vonna Pittman 101. Lay out your credentials, the work you've done, and in the process, really, what motivates you to bring De'Vonna, to the playing field every day.
Yeah, it's truly something else when I have to talk about myself and some of the things that I've done because I'm a young 51-year-old and I wrote my memoir. My first book was a memoir in 2017, so I was in my late 30s back then, and people were saying, "Well, how can you write a memoir when you're that young?" But some of the things that I experienced in my early years were worth talking about, and I felt like so much had happened up to that point that I needed to tell that story. So I became an author in 2017 when I published my first book. Published my second book in 2019, 2015, and last book in 2019. Right after I published my third book, I ran for office, ran for Hennepin County Commissioner, and it was an amazing time in my life. I lost by 1,200 out of 85,000 votes, but actually, it was crazy because it was something that I, just knew. I just knew that that's where my life was heading.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the amazing things that happened was as a result of running, I unseated a 30-year incumbent. So he retired. I mean, he felt the vibrancy of my campaign, and I had a lot of support from the community. So he just decided to retire, and then someone else got in the race who had a lot of political clout, and barely won, barely won, barely won. So, after the race, I mean, I have an 18-year career at Hennepin County where I worked in county administration, housing, community works and transit, community corrections, have a master's in policy and community corrections, police advisory. So, I thought once I got done with politics, I was going to work very closely with police leaders. But in the background, I had been formulating, so I was really interested in listening to the chemist. I had been formulating products, and my business just began to boom. So now I'm 100% focused on nature syrup, hair and skin care. But the expo was something that I created for the community, and I'm so proud to see it continue to live and thrive and have community at the forefront. So, yeah, we can talk more about the expo. The expo will always be a part of my life, my heart, and
Well,
that's it in a
let's do that.
nutshell.
Let's talk more about your books first of all. So tell us about each of the books you wrote, and start with the newest one, the one we just saw on the screen.
Okay.
What's that about? And then, what's the arc of the books? How do they relate to each other? Or are they completely distinct and different?
They're distinctively different.
Okay.
They're distinctively different. When I tell people that I've written a memoir, a book of poetry, and a romance novel, people are like, "Whoa, that's quite the spectrum." But the Savannah's in here. Well, I'll talk about my first book, the memoir.
Mhm.
The memoir is My Pretty and Its Ugly Truth. That book was written because I had endured sexual abuse, incest in my home growing up, and it was something that I had been going through life, um, traumatized, internally traumatized by. And the more I talked to women and even some men, I was hearing that people had been going through the same thing and
Mhm.
they weren't talking about it. They
Yeah.
weren't healing from it. We were carrying all of this weight and folks were struggling and it was something that I couldn't believe. Like I thought it was just happening in my house.
Mm.
But I realized that in our community, it happens a lot. It happens in many communities, but
Mhm.
specifically in the Black community, that elephant in the room is something that is always there. And so I wanted to bring light to it. I wanted to make sure that people who were struggling with the sins of their past or the sins of people in their family, that they could finally deal with it, and that people would know that they weren't alone. So that book starts. I start as early in the book as like 3 years old, and I'm singing 3 or 5 years old. I'm singing "Yes, Jesus Loves Me," because that was one of the things that I remembered as a kid was being dressed up in this pretty white dress, and I'm at school singing "Yes, Jesus Loves Me." And I was like, wow, like I really had a voice. I really felt empowered to be myself, to be in that moment. And I just remember feeling like I was so ambitious at that age. So that's kind of how the book starts out. But it tells the story of the teenage girl, all of the things that had happened, and then just the evolution of my life, how I moved to Minnesota when I was 21 years old as a single parent, and the book to me was not only a coming out, but it was also my way of inspiring and giving other folks space to heal and grow from the things that they had experienced.
Let me jump in. Yesterday, thank you for telling about that book and uh, the stories that you uncover and share with the intent of providing and supporting healing in our houses and our households. And you mentioned you discovered how pervasive the
Hmm.
question of sexual abuse is in the Black community. Well, yesterday I did an interview for SPNN Public Television where I
Hmm.
interviewed not doctor, but Reverend Pastor Parfait Intahuba. Intahuba. She is
Hmm.
from uh, Burundi, and she's one of three female pastors in the Evangelical Friends Church of Burundi. And she's also uh, with an organization that has 2,500 members. She's the national coordinator for the Quaker Peace Network of Burundi. But in telling her story, this is why it connects to you. She said the work they do in Burundi is to they started off dealing with HIV/AIDS, the prevalence and the exposure,
Hmm.
but a lot of the HIV/AIDS transmission was a reflection of sexual abuse,
Hmm.
of rape, men raping women in particular, but probably
Hmm.
boys as well, children. And she went into the story about in her own house, she grew up watching her father beat her mother every day. And so, and that's what got her as she grew up and got educated, focus on how could she make a difference by organizing people to discover an unarmed um, response to violence. The answer is not to be more violent, but to
Hmm.
figure out a intentionality of addressing violence in the Black community, violence against women in particular. So, that's just an aside. You reminded me that second and third book. Go ahead.
Absolutely. The second book, so I've always been a writer. I could always just pick up a pen and start writing. Hated math, hated social studies, hated gym, hated all of that stuff, but always found solitude in writing. So I've been just writing out these short rants and pieces of poetry. And so that's what the second book is. The second book, Literary Freedoms from the Heart.
Mhm.
And so you know, that book is very, very special to me, as they all are.
Mhm.
But this one, you can pick that book up and turn to any page and, you know, just be inspired.
Mm.
So, in that, I invited, I think like 25 other poets and writers to submit pieces. So there's also other um, contributors in
Mhm.
that book. And then, last but not least, the most exciting book that I've written, of course, is Savannah's Inheritance. I was actually coming off a high um, from my first book, My Pretty and Its Ugly Truth, when Savannah's Inheritance came to me.
Mm.
My husband and I were in the car riding to Chicago, driving to Chicago, and the book just started pouring, and I was like, "Oh my
Wow.
God, I need some paper. I need the story." It was so weird and crazy.
Mm.
My husband's driving, I'm on the passenger side, and the grandmother. I know WD read the book, and so the grandmother came to me first before Savannah, and I could see her walking, and I thought she was walking into a prison, but she was walking into a sanitarium to visit her daughter. But all of that came to me in the car. And so just like the whole first chapter came to me in the car. And then it was crazy because I didn't get the rest of the book for like 3, 4 years.
Wow.
And I had no idea where it would go, what would happen, who the characters would be. And it was the hardest thing that I've ever done before in my life because I'm continually trying to find the material to piece it together. So I
Well,
still feel like there's so much more to tell.
we have to come back and tell some more because this is too much to talk about. We're almost out of time. I want to have you take 10 seconds and invite people to the is the expo coming up
The
or
expo is it's usually every October.
okay.
It was founded in 2017. I don't know if I said that. We started with 40 authors. Since
Yeah.
then, we've been able to support over 700 authors. So please go to our website, Black Authors Expo.com. There's actually going to be an event. I think it's next week. I will give you guys the day. The date, again, I'm just advising now, but I believe May 14th at
Mhm.
Open Book, there's going to be a gathering of authors.
Great, great. Well, thank you, De'Vonna. Thank you, W.D. Foster Graham. Bring in Dr. Roger again. Dr. Roger, thank you. This has been a wonderful hour. I got 10 seconds in any reaction response, Dr. Roger.
No, I just, when I woke up one morning and the thought of the character in my short story came to me, it just, when you were driving to Chicago, it brought back memories.
Same thing. Well,
Yes.
listen, this is
Yes.
a wonderful place for us to be together. I'm Al McFarlane. This is The Conversation with Al McFarlane. We'll see you next time. Tomorrow, actually, at 1 o'clock, The Healing Circle with Dr. Dr. Bavala Akansanya, and Dr. Oliver Williams talking about our health, mental health, whole body health. Join us. We'll see you then.